January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The frozen earth trembles beneath the weight of retreating armor. Snow-dusted FIR trees stand as silent witnesses to columns of German panzers withdrawing eastward, their engines coughing black smoke into the pale winter sky. Above them, the clouds part momentarily, and through that narrow tier in the heavens, a sound emerges distant. At first, then growing into a mechanical thunder that drowns out even the grinding of tank treads. Oberst Friedrich von Manteuffel cranes his neck upward, his breath forming white plumes in the frigid air, and counts them. 37, 41, 56 aircraft. Then he stops counting. The sky itself has become America. 6 weeks earlier, on December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein with profound conviction. 3 German armies, more than 200,000 men, nearly 600 tanks and assault guns crashed through the thinly defended Ardennes sector with the fury of a nation making its final gamble. The Luftwaffe High Command had promised air cover. Hermann Göring himself had declared that 3,000 aircraft stood ready to support the offensive, that German fighters would contest every meter of airspace, that the Jabots, the Allied fighter bombers that had tormented German forces since Normandy, would finally meet their match. The ground commanders, veterans of Poland and France and the vast Russian steppes, allowed themselves to believe they had seen what surprise and audacity could achieve. They remembered when the Luftwaffe had ruled the skies, but the German soldiers advancing through those snow-laden forests in December expected something else entirely. They expected the weather to remain their ally, the thick clouds and winter storms grounding. The Allied air forces, as they had during the offensive's first crucial days, they expected their own fighters to appear in numbers, the Me-200, and 62 jets that propaganda had promised would sweep the Americans from the sky. They expected, perhaps, a return to the warfare they remembered when German tactical doctrine and armored formations had been enough, when the sky had not yet become an inescapable trap. What they experienced instead was revelation written in fire across the winter sky. By December 23, the weather cleared, and with it came an aerial avalanche that no German commander who witnessed it would ever forget. On that single day, the Allied air forces flew more than 15,000 sorties over the Ardennes battlefield. 15,000. The number itself defied comprehension for men whose own air force could barely muster 200 sorties across the entire Western Front. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs materialized over every road, every crossroads, every village where German columns attempted to move. British Typhoons screamed down from 4,000 feet, their rockets turning Panther tanks into burning coffins. American B-26 Marauders flew in formations so dense they darkened the sky, their bomb load transforming supply depots and rail yards into moonscapes of shattered earth and twisted steel. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, recorded in his post-battle report a sentence of stark simplicity. The Allied air superiority was so overwhelming that movement by day became virtually impossible. His colleague, SS Brigadeführer Fritz Kramer, Chief of Staff to 6th Panzer Army, was more visceral in his assessment. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting an entire industrial civilization that had taken flight. The historical record bears witness to their despair. In the village of Bastogne, American paratroopers held out against overwhelming German ground forces precisely because the sky belonged to America. On December 26, when Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the encircled defender, it was American fighter bombers that had destroyed the German reserves rushing to prevent the breakthrough. Along the roads from St. Vith to Houffalize, the wreckage told its own story. More than 400 German tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, many of them untouched by ground fire, their crews having fled after witnessing the relentless aerial assault. The Luftwaffe's promised 3,000 aircraft never materialized. German records show that on the best days, fewer than 300 fighters managed to reach the battlefield. They were met by American fighter screens flying in squadron and group strength, outnumbering them 10 to 1. The transformation this wrought in German military thinking cannot be overstated. These were not inexperienced officers prone to panic or exaggeration. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commander of Army Group B and architect of the Ardennes Offensive, had earned his reputation as a defensive genius on the Eastern Front, a master of improvisation who had stabilized collapsing sectors through sheer tactical brilliance. General Oberst Josef Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, had led armored formations since 1940. These men understood combined arms warfare. They had studied American tactics since North Africa. Yet what they witnessed in the Ardennes skies shattered their conceptual framework. In the war diaries and interrogation transcripts that followed Germany's surrender, a pattern emerges in their testimonies. They speak not merely of tactical defeat, but of technological and industrial revelation. They describe an American air capability that seemed to operate on principles beyond traditional military logistics. How did the Americans maintain such sortie rates? German fighters required days of maintenance for every hour of flight time, yet the American aircraft appeared fresh each morning, wave after wave, as if produced overnight by some inexhaustible factory in the sky. How did they coordinate so precisely with ground forces? German commanders watched American P-47s arrive within 15 minutes of radio requests from forward observers, watched them strike with practiced accuracy at targets marked by colored smoke, watched them return to Ream and launch again before the smoke had cleared. The symbolic weight of this disparity crystallized around a single image that appeared repeatedly in German accounts: the American supply drop. During the siege of Bastogne, when German forces surrounded the town and confidently predicted its surrender through starvation and ammunition depletion, American transport aircraft flew through anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies by parachute. Not meager survival rations, but abundant deliveries, artillery shells, medical supplies, gasoline, and food in quantities that seemed deliberately excessive. German soldiers, subsisting on reduced rations and watching their own supply columns incinerated from the air, observed through binoculars as multicolored parachutes blossomed over Bastogne like flowers in snow. An interrogated German officer, a Hauptmann from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, described watching those drops with some approaching metaphysical despair. It was as if they were demonstrating not just their strength, but their wastefulness. They could afford to rain abundance from the sky while we starved beneath it. This abundance became a recurring theme in German assessments, not simply material superiority, but a kind of casual plenty that spoke to fundamental differences in national character and industrial capacity. American pilots flew 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties in a single day. German pilots, when they could fly at all, were rationed to missions of such brief duration that they often engaged and disengaged within minutes, their fuel gauges dictating tactics more than enemy action. American aircraft losses were replaced within days, sometimes hours, by fresh machines flown in from rear departs. German losses were permanent subtractions from a dwindling pool. Most telling of all, captured American pilots often carried personal items that astonished their captors: chocolate bars, cigarettes, paperback books, writing materials, even small luxuries like chewing gum and playing cards. These men went into combat as if departing on temporary business trips, their survival kits provisioned with an optimism that itself seemed a weapon of psychological warfare. Oberst Günther Lützow, one of Germany's most experienced fighter aces with more than 100 victories, submitted a report after flying defensive sorties over the Ardennes that reads like an elegy. He described encountering an American fighter formation so large he initially mistook it for a bomber stream. When his small group of FW-19 Zerus attempted to engage, they were immediately bracketed by American fighters diving from superior altitude, their positions evidently radioed ahead by controllers tracking every German aircraft from the moment of takeoff. Lützow escaped. 4 of his pilots did not. In his report's conclusion, he wrote, "We are no longer fighting pilots. We are fighting a system of radar, radio, industrial production, and trained manpower so integrated that individual courage becomes irrelevant." They have mechanized air superiority itself. This mechanization, this systematization of aerial warfare represents something the German military establishment had failed to anticipate. The Luftwaffe had been designed around the concept of quality over quantity, of superbly trained pilots flying advanced aircraft in support of rapid ground offensives. It was a doctrine born from Germany's limited resources and proved effective in short, decisive campaigns. But the Ardennes revealed the fatal flaw in this thinking. American air power was not a collection of individual pilots and planes, but an industrial organism of vast, self-sustaining ecosystem of aircraft production, pilot training, maintenance infrastructure, fuel supply, and tactical coordination that could absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger within weeks. Between D-Day and the end of the Ardennes Offensive, American forces lost more than 4,000 aircraft in the European theater. Yet on January 1st, 1945, when the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate massed attack on Allied airfields, the Americans had more operational aircraft than they'd possessed 6 months earlier. The transformation in German thinking becomes most evident in the orders and assessment issued after the Ardennes Offensive collapsed in January 1945. Gone was the aggressive rhetoric of aerial combat and contested airspace. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, who assumed command of the Western Front in March 1945, issued tactical directives that read more like survival manuals than military strategies: move only at night, disperse immediately when aircraft engines are heard, prepare covered positions before attempting any daylight assembly. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Wehrmacht Operations Staff, summarized the situation with bureaucratic precision. In a January 28 briefing to Hitler, air superiority is no longer a tactical consideration. It is an absolute condition that determines all other possibilities. But perhaps the most haunting acknowledgement came from Hermann Göring himself, the Reichsmarshal who had built the Luftwaffe into the world's most feared air force, who had promised to protect German cities from bombing, who had assured Hitler that air power would tip the balance in the Ardennes. In April 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and Soviet forces closed on Berlin, Göring met with his few remaining staff officers. One of them, Oberst Bernd von Brauchitsch, later recalled the Reichsmarschall's words: "The Americans did not defeat us in the air. They simply made air warfare itself irrelevant by achieving such superiority that no amount of German skill or courage could matter. They industrialized the sky." This was the crux of the acknowledgement, not merely that America possessed more aircraft, but that American air power represented a qualitatively different phenomenon, a transformation of warfare itself from an art of individual combat into an industrial process. Every element of American aviation spoke to this transformation: the training pipeline that produced 20,000 new pilots annually, the aircraft factories that delivered 5,000 planes per month, the logistics network that shipped 100-octane aviation fuel across the Atlantic by the tanker load, the radio and radar systems that made every American aircraft part of a unified battlefield awareness network, the maintenance echelons that could rebuild engines in field conditions, the photo reconnaissance units that mapped every German position daily, the weather forecasting service that planned operations with scientific precision. German commanders, educated in a military tradition that emphasized operational artistry, individual leadership, and the decisive battle, found themselves confronting an opponent who had made warfare systematic, repeatable, and ultimately predictable in its overwhelming application. An American air attack was not an event but a process, one that began with photo reconnaissance, proceeded through targeting analysis, involved weather assessment and route planning, employed radar-guided navigation and fighter escort, executed synchronized bombing or strafing runs, and concluded with bomb damage assessment and follow-up planning. It was warfare as industrial procedure, and it produced results with industrial consistency. The symbolic object that haunted German memories of the Ardennes sky was neither weapon nor aircraft, but something more mundane, and therefore more devastating: the contrail. In the clear January skies above the collapsing German offensive, American aircraft flew at such operational altitude and in such numbers that their condensation trails wove a lattice of white lines across the blue expanse. German soldiers looking up could read the sky like a text written in vapor, each line representing power beyond their reach. Each intersecting trail a mission they could not prevent. Those contrails became visible proof of an unreachable superiority. German fighters, struggling to reach operational altitude on diluted synthetic fuel, could rarely climb high enough to engage the American fighter bombers effectively. The contrails hung there geometric, pristine, unreachable like the signature of gods inscribing messages in a language of pure capability. By war's end, when German generals sat for Allied interrogations, their assessments of American air power carried a consistent note of something approaching philosophical acceptance. They had not simply lost the aerial battle over the Ardennes, they had witnessed the obsolescence of their entire conceptual framework for warfare. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German panzer doctrine, observed in his interrogation that the tank did not become obsolete in this war, but the idea that ground forces alone could win wars became a historical artifact. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots, was more succinct. We were flying fighters. They were flying industry. The Ardennes Offensive ended not with a climactic battle but with a steady, grinding evaporation of German capability and a constant aerial pressure. Tanks that survived direct combat were abandoned for lack of fuel, their supply columns destroyed from the air. Troops that withstood artillery bombardment retreated in disorder when American P-47s appeared, because discipline could not withstand 8 Fixkey caliber machine guns firing from a diving aircraft. Commanders who maintained their nerve in ground combat reported psychological collapse among their men at the mere sound of approaching aircraft engines. The German army that withdrew from the Ardennes in late January 1945 was tactically defeated, but more profoundly it was existentially exhausted, worn down by the knowledge that the sky itself had become enemy territory from which there was no shelter and against which there was no effective response. This acknowledgement, this recognition of American air superiority not as temporary circumstance, but as permanent condition, marked the true end of German strategic ambition in World War II. After the Ardennes, no serious German commander believed victory was possible. They fought on for various reasons: ideology, fear, loyalty, duty, but not because they thought they could win. The sky had rendered the question moot. And so the symbolic truth embedded in those Ardennes contrails persists beyond the historical particulars of that battle, that industrial democracy, when fully mobilized, could produce not just more weapons but a qualitatively different kind of warfare, one in which abundance itself became a strategic weapon, in which the very sky could be transformed into an instrument of victory through the systematic application of organized capability. The German commanders who acknowledged American air superiority after the Ardennes were acknowledging something larger, that the future belonged not to the tactically brilliant or the individually courageous, but to those who could harness industrial civilization itself to the purposes of war. They had fought against the sky, and the sky, filled with the humming machinery of American production, had won.